There is a tax almost everyone pays, but almost no one sees it. It does not appear on your paycheck, it is not debated during elections, and you will never receive a bill for it. Yet it quietly reduces the value of everything you earn. Most people believe inflation is simply the result of rising prices, that food becomes more expensive, rent goes up, and energy costs climb. The common explanation is simple: companies charge more. Sometimes the story blames supply chains, greed, or global crises, but those explanations only describe the surface symptoms. They do not explain the underlying mechanism, because inflation is not primarily about prices rising. Inflation is about money losing purchasing power. And purchasing power does not disappear randomly. It disappears through a process embedded directly inside the modern monetary system. To understand this process, you must stop looking at prices. Instead, you must look at money itself, how it is created, who creates it, and what happens when the supply of money expands. Specifically, what happens when it expands faster than the supply of real goods and services. Once you understand that mechanism, a quiet structural truth becomes impossible to ignore. The system does not need to confiscate your wealth, it only needs to dilute it. Modern money is not backed by gold, commodities, or physical reserves. It is backed by debt. This structure emerged gradually during the 20th century, culminating in 1971. That was the year the United States formally ended the convertibility of the dollar into gold. From that moment forward, the global monetary system became fully fiat-based. Fiat money derives value primarily from legal authority and economic trust, but its supply is no longer constrained by a physical anchor. Instead, it is governed by monetary policy decisions. Central banks can expand the money supply through several mechanisms, such as lowering interest rates, purchasing government debt, expanding bank reserves, or creating liquidity through asset purchases. Each of these tools increases the amount of money circulating in the financial system. To understand why this happens repeatedly, we must examine incentives. Governments operate under constant fiscal pressure. They must fund infrastructure, social programs, public salaries, and increasingly large debt obligations. Historically, governments could finance spending through three primary methods: taxation, borrowing, and currency expansion. Taxation is politically unpopular, and borrowing eventually reaches limits as debt accumulates. That leaves the third option, expanding the money supply. This process often begins subtly. When central banks purchase government bonds, they inject newly created money into the financial system. Banks receive additional reserves, financial markets receive liquidity, and credit becomes easier to obtain. At first, this expansion stimulates economic activity. Asset prices often rise, stock markets benefit, and real estate becomes more expensive as financial assets appreciate. But the increase in money supply does not remain confined to financial markets forever. Over time, it spreads through the broader economy, and when more money chases the same amount of goods, purchasing power declines. Importantly, this process does not affect everyone equally. Those closest to newly created money benefit first. Economists refer to this phenomenon as the Cantillon effect. It is named after the 18th century economist Richard Cantillon. When new money enters the system, it flows through specific channels like government spending, financial institutions, and large corporations. These participants receive the money before prices adjust. They can purchase assets, invest, and allocate capital while purchasing power remains relatively stable. By the time the new money spreads through the economy, prices begin to rise. Consequently, households, particularly wage earners, experience the cost increase last. This creates a structural transfer of purchasing power, not through taxation but through monetary dilution. This suggests a critical financial consequence. When the money supply expands faster than economic productivity, the real value of savings held in currency gradually declines. This mechanism is not unique to modern economies. Monetary dilution has appeared repeatedly throughout history. The tools change, but the incentives remain the same. One of the earliest documented examples occurred in the Roman Empire. During the early centuries of Rome, silver coins known as denarii contained high levels of precious metal. But as the empire expanded, military campaigns and administrative costs increased dramatically. Rather than raising taxes to politically destabilizing levels, Roman authorities began reducing the silver content of coins. Coins that once contained nearly pure silver gradually became diluted with base metals. The number of coins in circulation increased, but the intrinsic value of each coin declined. Over time, merchants adjusted prices accordingly. The result was a slow erosion of purchasing power. A similar pattern emerged centuries later in the Weimar Republic during the early 1920s. Germany faced massive war reparations and economic instability following World War I. To meet these obligations, the government expanded the money supply rapidly. At first, the increase stimulated economic activity, but as monetary expansion accelerated, inflation spiraled out of control. Prices began doubling within days. Eventually, the German mark lost nearly all purchasing power. This extreme example demonstrates the endpoint of uncontrolled monetary expansion. However, monetary dilution does not need to reach hyperinflation to produce meaningful effects. Even moderate inflation erodes purchasing power significantly over time. Consider the United States. According to long-term inflation data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the purchasing power of the US dollar has declined by over 85% since 1971. In practical terms, goods that cost $1 in the early 1970s now require more than $7. The decline occurred gradually, but the cumulative effect is profound. These historical patterns suggest an economic parallel. When monetary systems operate without hard supply constraints, purchasing power erosion becomes a structural tendency, not an occasional anomaly. The erosion of purchasing power has measurable economic consequences. These consequences appear across multiple layers of the financial system. First, currency dilution affects savings behavior. When individuals hold large portions of wealth in cash or low-yield savings accounts, inflation steadily reduces the real value of those holdings. For example, if inflation averages 3% per year, purchasing power declines roughly 50% over 24 years. This means that long-term savers must continuously earn returns that exceed inflation. Second, monetary expansion contributes to asset repricing. As liquidity increases, capital often flows into financial assets like equities, real estate, and commodities to preserve purchasing power. Over the past several decades, major stock indices and property markets have risen significantly. While technological progress and productivity contribute to this growth, expanding liquidity has played a structural role. This dynamic can create widening wealth gaps between asset holders and individuals whose income comes primarily from wages. Third, inflation affects real wages. If wages rise more slowly than prices, purchasing power declines even when nominal income increases. This has been observed across multiple developed economies. In many countries, wage growth has struggled to keep pace with housing, healthcare, and education costs. The result is a growing perception that everyday expenses are rising faster than incomes. This perception reflects a real structural pressure. Fourth, debt dynamics interact closely with inflation. When governments carry large debt burdens, moderate inflation can reduce the real value of that debt. In effect, inflation redistributes economic pressure from borrowers to holders of currency and fixed-income assets. This does not eliminate the debt, but it reduces its real weight relative to economic output. These patterns produce a structural implication. If monetary expansion continues over long periods, individuals who rely exclusively on fiat savings become increasingly exposed to purchasing power erosion. Those who hold assets that respond positively to liquidity expansion, such as equities, scarce commodities, or monetary alternatives, tend to preserve value more effectively. Understanding monetary dilution does not require outrage, it requires clarity. The system was not designed primarily to protect purchasing power. It was designed to maintain economic flexibility. Governments need the ability to respond to recessions, financial crises, and debt cycles. Central banks need tools to stabilize liquidity and credit markets. Expanding the money supply provides those tools, but every mechanism carries consequences. When money supply expands persistently, the value of money itself becomes less stable over time. This is not always visible year by year, but across decades the effect becomes unmistakable. Purchasing power erodes, assets reprice, and economic incentives shift. For individuals, the most important shift is psychological. Once you understand the structure, inflation stops appearing random. Price increases begin to look like signals of deeper monetary dynamics. Savings strategies begin to change, asset allocation becomes more intentional, and long-term thinking replaces short-term reaction. Throughout history, societies have experimented with different forms of money: commodity money, metallic standards, paper currency, and fiat systems. Each system reflects the technological and political conditions of its time. Today's system prioritizes flexibility and credit expansion. But it also requires individuals to think more carefully about how they preserve purchasing power across decades. because the system does not take wealth suddenly. It erodes it slowly, quietly, and almost invisibly through the arithmetic of monetary expansion. Once you understand that arithmetic, a different question emerges. Not why are prices rising, but instead, where should value be stored when money itself is expanding? Understanding that question is the first step toward financial awareness. Not rebellion, not panic, just clarity about how the structure works. And clarity changes how you move inside the system.